I try to read this Luke verse 7 to 14 as how we should approach heaven. An approach is really being humbled in order for us to then be exalted by Jesus, by God, who would kind of raise us to a higher status. And that both has a double meaning: higher status in the banquet and higher status in spiritual life. And so for me, I took that interaction of seating yourself at a high position and then being asked by the host to change seats. I took that more as us trying to be like Jesus. We're trying to take Jesus' spot. And for us, we would think, I know how to get to heaven. I know how to enter it. And that's us kind of taking that seat of honor in the heavenly banquet. And then God coming over and being like, this spot is for Jesus. Jesus only knows how to enter into heaven. The proper way of entering heaven would be to understand our position. Jesus holds the highest honor, and we have to take that lower role behind him, following him. And in doing so, that's when God will come to us and be like, please move up, please be exalted, please be lifted up.
We often come back to this point. We manage life. And I think the danger of managing life deludes us into believing we do have an agency or a power that we really don't have. So internally, anyway, that doesn't position us in a way to receive the gift, the grace that we're constantly being offered in the spiritual life. But I don't think we realize it. You're using that language specifically when you spoke. That's a way to face it unequivocally. And I think that's really important. We've often talked about this before too. I think in America, efficiency is important and managing is important and all of that. And then we tend to slip into, we actually earn heaven. And then we would appropriate the highest seat because it adds up. All that we've done adds up to this. So I'm not even presuming anything. This is just the natural conclusion of what I've done. And that's the danger part.
There were several reflections where I read that they spoke about the definition of humility, and they kind of went back to the origin of the word, kind of meaning of the soil, from the soil. And I think a couple of people spoke about this, but maybe I'm taking it a bit further, where it's not necessarily, if we take humility as from the soil, it's not, the emphasis shouldn't be we are lowly, we're of low status. Being humble, I'm taking it as we were formed from the soil. So we were without life until God breathed life into us. So the reminder is not necessarily that we are of soil, but we were just soil until God gave us life. And by us, I mean everyone. And so humility then, it not only orders my relationship to God, but it also orders my relationship with everyone else, because we're all on the same page. God first, us second.
And I've always thought that the truth of humility then is not, you mentioned low status as opposed to lowliness. That's a very good, important distinction, I think. People that are truly humble have an authentic sense of loneliness, has nothing to do with no worth at all. It has everything to do with realizing the gift of our worth, and the focus of all this, of course, is God, which makes us authentically and appropriately lowly and humble, but not worthless or without status. So to me, when I think of the root of the word humble being earth, I just think it roots us in reality. I think of earth is the place in which plants and trees and so on are rooted. And I think true humility roots us in reality, reality being the different nuance between low and lowliness, which is, it positions the center of everything in God and not in us. If we're truly humble, we're rooted in the truth that everything is gift and that we are connected to all of creation and definitely to one another. Community becomes the main corrective in the kingdom. So people you're very good friends with, or your siblings, if you have good relationships with them, you'll either do something or say something, and it won't be uncommon for the sibling or good friend to say, "What? You did what?" And if nothing else, even if you fight about it or argue about it, you're given pause because something is reflected back to you, right? So that you can process it. If you don't have those kind of connections with anybody, you're never given that, what I'm calling a corrective, which brings us back to, once again, the strength of community and how definitive it is of kingdom and of our own growth, emotionally, psychologically, spiritually. Bringing it back to the root has always given me a different sense of people that walk around like this, that I think we used to believe were humble because they didn't speak out. Maybe not humble at all. Maybe just posturing, or for a psychological reason, they're just like that because they don't have good social skills.
That ties in with the latter part of what Jesus was saying in the gospel, of how when you hold a lunch or a dinner, invite poor, the crippled, the lame, the blind. And I think it's for that reason that you're just mentioning, for community, because we're all interconnected. These group of people, the poor, the crippled, the lame, they're not in a proper state of living, generally speaking, in this time period. They may be mistreated, not looked after. And so if they're not looked after, because we're a community, we need to make sure that they're included. They're entered into the same community as we are, from being humble, from understanding that we're all the same. Therefore, that's why we have to, if we are truly humble and we're understanding our roles, our positioning, it will be very logical to just say, yes, of course, I would invite the poor, the crippled, the lame, the blind, or any other person who isn't in the same position as I am, because we are actually equal. Just because I have more resources and someone else doesn't, that kind of puts me in the higher position, social status wise, or even economically. But that shouldn't be the case, because we're all the same. So therefore, I will share what I have with my brother and sisters, because at the end of the day, we are meant to still eat, have the same living conditions as everyone else. And that's what drives that action, because I truly understand what it means to be humble.
What I'm hearing is that once we get a true sense of what this means, we cannot be passive about living with the knowledge. Somehow we have to incarnate it. And the other thing is that exclusivity of any kind is antithetical to the kingdom, right? So think of what Jesus was doing in the Mediterranean world at this time. You only ate with your equals, and meal sharing was hugely more significant than most people think of it now, even though I still claim that breaking bread and with whom you break it is enormously important. Food is enormously important. And how we share it and with whom we share it is very significant. And we don't think about that so much anymore. But in those days, you only ate with your equals. Also, you only invited people to your meals who could in turn invite you back. So think of what Jesus was doing in this kingdom walking and talking that his life on earth was. He was trying to broaden a very delineated, stratified society. He was trying to upend that by saying, you absolutely invite people that can't invite you back. So we hear this many generations later. We hear that in a more muted way than I think the first century people would have heard it. And it's good to be reminded of that, because we can't soften the message. It's too easy to become passive with the message and intellectualize it and leave it there, when in fact we're called to act on it. So in other words, we have to do something with not just the knowledge of it, but the truth of every Eucharist we attend, which celebrates our connection with the world. And I'm talking even the cosmology, let alone the humanity in it, right? That we can't separate that and live as though that's in a different compartment in my brain, and my life is going to go on as it was before. Certainly for the first century people that heard this, if they took it to heart, their lives wouldn't go on as before. And so then what does that mean for us now in 2022? First of all, to be receptive to what the power of that is, and then to incarnate it somehow if we're serious about the kingdom. There was just one other thing. George Smiga is a priest from Ohio who's a scripture scholar. And on this particular gospel, he offered a new way for me to think about this that I hadn't before. He said, maybe a big message of this about sitting at the front and being moved to the back and vice versa is just to remember that life is going to change. And what will be constant will be the presence of God accompanying you in whatever it is. If you're in good health, you won't always be in good health. If you have a job you like, it won't always be that way. If, you know, everything about life is by definition change. And I had never thought about this gospel in those words. And it kind of opened up something for me and thought it was worth bringing to this conversation.